Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Stephen Saideman from Carleton University. He was at the NATO summit this week, so I figured who better to talk to than you about everything that we heard and what went on.
Well, to be fair, Dale, a pleasure to be here. I was at the public forum, which is a side party next to it. So we were in the hotel next door to the convention center, but that
Okay.
meant that they would drag over leaders from the one building to our building and have them. And it was pretty high level. We actually got to see the Secretary of State, we got to see the Secretary of Defense, the head of the military head of NATO, the Secretary General always shows up at these things, but we got a higher level of folks. Lots of prime ministers and presidents. We did not get the Canadian Prime Minister, but we did get the Spanish one and a bunch of other ones.
Yeah, well, the Canadian Prime Minister was busy making some of his own announcements, which we'll get to in a minute. But let's talk about, I guess, just some of the outcomes of this particular NATO summit. It seems to me that one of them is moving along the path for Ukraine to make permanent membership. How is that unfolding?
Well, each year they have to basically tell Ukraine, when your war is done, you're welcome to join the alliance. And so this time they talked about a short, well-lit, irreversible bridge.
Okay.
In practice, what that really meant was they set up a new NATO command to take over from the United States or take over from whoever else was doing it. The coordination of the um, to take over the coordination of the moving of the arms shipments, essentially,
Right,
figuring
right.
out what the Ukrainians need, how to get it to them quickly, that kind of thing. So they did that, and they did also that's going to be involved with training and helping them move to make progress in all the different requirements for becoming a NATO member. Obviously, the most important requirement is not to be at war, and that's not something that they can be helped with.
Yeah. It would also seem to me that by moving this away from the Americans and into NATO hands, it's a little bit of future proofing in case things go pear-shaped in November.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about Trump proofing, and I had fun at the start of the week being the lone picture on a foreign affairs article of saying that if Trump were to become president again, would NATO survive the experience? And I said no. So there was much discussion about that as well. Not in I don't know if it was being discussed in the circles of the summit itself, but in the side party, there's a lot of conversation about what does a new Trump administration mean for NATO.
Yeah. Um, and I guess that's just kind of where I wanted to ask is what were some of those conversations like, considering I did notice certain American politicians were basically politicking throughout the summit. How was that was that over? I'm trying to think of the right word. Did that like kind of overtake the discourse there, or was it just like a distraction going on?
It didn't overtake the discourse, but certainly lots of folks who were there from around the world were uh, full of doom and gloom about the prospects for the election. And I was a strange voice of optimism saying that Biden will still win. But if he doesn't win, it'll be catastrophe. But that was part of the message, which is I think a lot of people will understand how catastrophic it is and therefore will avoid it.
Yeah. Okay. Um, the other thing, as we were mentioning, was Canada made some announcements in terms of submarines. They say up to 12, but I'm going to guess 6 to 8 is a more reasonable estimate. Um, and this pathway to 2%, they're saying 2032.
Right.
Um, we have some voices saying, not fast enough, other voices saying not credible enough. What's your particular read on any of this?
Well, they came out with their defense policy update in April, and that said 1.76% by 2029. So now they're saying 2% by 2020, 2032. And it's like, how are you going to get that? And what do those extra 3 years buy you? And I think it's credible in the sense that they are going to spend more money, that they are
Yeah.
going to do some of the things that are get them closer to 2%. I think some of the specific commitments are unrealistic, which is No way is it going to be 12. They don't have the personnel for the current Navy that they got, which
Yeah.
includes four broken submarines, which means you don't really need to have four different crews for the subs. You just need one or two because they're not, they don't serve at the same time.
Yeah.
Getting up to six might be possible. 12 is, I just can't imagine that ever happening. But it's, as someone put it, taking all the things that are defensive for you as saying, well, be exploring these things and turning them into commitments.
Yeah.
Uh, and that raises a bunch of different questions, like why did they do this in April? Um, why did they think they could withstand the pressure in April, but then folded as they got the pressure in June and July? They were blasted by business groups. They were blasted by U.S. senators. They were blasted by Mike Johnson, although who cares about Mike Johnson? He's just a person, Speaker of the House. Um, but they seemed, there was a whole lot of pressure, and they gave into it. But they gave into it in a last minute kind of way, which undermines the credibility of the promise because it seems like it was just, okay, you want us to do it, we'll do it. And they say there's a plan, but there's not really a plan. However, there are a couple of things that were pretty credible about it, or harder, which is that there was an agreement between the United States, Finland, and Canada to make icebreakers together, since we're all having problems fielding icebreakers, and we
Yeah.
all have different expertise in that art. And so by making an agreement, that kind of makes it a little more real. Likewise, there was apparently some sort of agreement between the Norwegians, the Germans, and the Canadians on technology development. And since there has been a very, very strong effort by two of those countries to get Canada to sign on to future submarine buying, there might be a connection there, which is it's either be the South Korean subs or the German/Norwegian sub effort.
Hmm.
And so by having this agreement with the Germans, the Norwegians, it suggests that they are a likely contender and that they're serious about doing this. If
Okay.
this was the case, that if we ever got into business submarines, it would add a lot of money to the defense budget and it would get us closer to 2%. So that was the easiest one-off item they could do.
Yeah.
I do think that they're probably end up starting to spend a lot more money on personnel recruitment and retention because it's a huge issue. And they should have
Hmm.
been throwing money at it before, but I think they're going to throw more money at it now simply because that is one of the ways in which they can get to 2% quickly. Because the thing is this, we can agree to buy submarines right today.
Yeah.
We're not going to be having the submarines docked in Canada in what, 7 years, 8 years? It's going to take a long time for us to do the
Yeah.
procurement. And so how are they going to account for our 2% spending unless we buy them up front before they're delivered, which is not the way we do things. It's the way the Finns do things. That's how the Finns got to 2%. They bought the, they literally bought
I
the
have been
F-35.
pointing out to people this whole week as they grouse about Canada. It's like, well, not every country is accounting for their 2% the same way we are.
Everybody is doing it in different ways, but the Finns bought their F-35s up front before they're delivered, paid for them up front, and that means that they are now in a bit of a crisis because they have to run around trying to figure out how to get to 2% and spend money once that big pig is passed through the snake,
Yeah.
if that image makes sense.
Yeah. Um, so we've got this path. So the other big news that we haven't talked about yet is we have a new chief of defense staff officially starting next week. You have met her. Tell me your impressions.
Lieutenant General Jenny Carignan is the next Chief of Defense Staff. She's spent the past 3 years running a new command, the Chief of Professional Content and Culture, which was basically a new command set up to try to change the culture of the military so that way it would be A, more professional, B, change the notion of what it means to be professional, and C, try to get rid of this abuse of power slash sexual misconduct stuff that fell, somewhere around a dozen senior officers, including two of the previous chiefs of defense staff.
Yeah.
Uh, and I've met her on a few occasions. She was actually one of the second person on the podcast I host because we met her at a conference in Kingston. She's sharp. She's serious. I think uh, she has a well-rounded experience. She did lead our combat mission in Iraq when we were hunting down terrorists or supporting the Iraqi effort to fight ISIS back in
Mhm.
a few years ago. So she has that experience. She's got a variety of other experiences. I think by being the person in charge of a very new command, that she had to set up from scratch and then deal with the most contentious issues in the military. Uh, it involved her having to get into the weeds of what does the Air Force do, what does the Navy do, what does the Army do. She has a broad range of understanding and experiences. So I think she's a very serious person,
Yeah.
and I think she's well qualified for the job. People will raise the question of whether they just picked her because she's a woman. I don't, and I think that matters. I think that was possibly one of the things that was going on. She's a
Mhm.
francophone. She's from Quebec. I mean, she talks with a French accent. So you can argue that this is a gambit by Trudeau to pander to Quebecers and to women. But just like when they picked Anita Anand to be Minister of Defense after Harjit Sajjan failed so miserably at being the Minister of Defense during the
Yeah.
whole sexual misconduct scandal, yeah, the gender mattered, but Anand was super qualified, super smart. She did all of her homework, did all the reading, was serious about doing the job.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is here too. Is she being set up to fail to lead a military that's in crisis? Yeah, I'm not sure. It depends on what they do. And by
Yeah.
giving the military a lot more money, which they decided after they chose her, I think they're actually helping her out. But she does face resistance. There is the Conservative Party has been very loud about being anti-woke, and so the question is whether she survives in this position if the Conservatives get into power.
Yeah.
It is a valid question to ask because she's sort of the symbol of everything that they've been proclaiming that they hate about the military, being
Yeah.
tough, inclusive, and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, they made a big point this week about going back to warrior culture and not really spelling out what that means.
It means they're not going to spend 2%. That's what it
Well,
means.
that too.
I mean, Phil Gassé had a series of good Substacks this week, and one of them was, what is Trudeau doing about making this decision at the last minute? And the other was on, well, what would the Conservatives do? And it's very clear that Poilievre doesn't want to say anything specific about anything, but
Yeah,
he really, really cares about deficits. And if you really, really care about deficits, then you cut the defense budget because that's where the discretionary money is.
yeah,
And so it's interesting that the language he used was, or his team, like in James Bazan, is likely to be Minister of Defense under a conservative government, used
maybe.
we will aspire to get to 2%, which is the language that Harper and other politicians in NATO put into the 2014 Wales pledge that meant we didn't actually have to be at 2% in 2024. We just had to hope to be or move
Yeah,
toward.
yeah. I mean, conservatives like aspirational targets, particularly around things like emissions reductions and so on too. Um, they were very big on the aspirational aspect and not actually doing anything. One of the things I am wondering about Karen Yall is whether she is the first female chief of defense staff or whatever similar title across G7 or NATO or these particular allied countries, or if there are others that she's joining the ranks of. Because I know it is still very much an old boys club, and in a lot of countries, they didn't let women in frontline combat roles, whereas she does have that experience.
That's exactly right, which is that for most democratic militaries, the folks who get promoted to the top are those who have operational experience. That is, they've been in combat or been near combat, that they've either are Army, Air Force, they're artillery, infantry, or armor in the Army, or they're a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot, or they've commanded combat ships in their navies.
Yeah,
And she's a combat engineer, which is counted as a combat arms because while the engineers are often at the front lines doing things, so that way the infantry folks can actually do their work. Like combat
yeah,
engineers, for instance, got to D-Day first before everybody else to blow up the mines and obstacles on the beaches. So combat engineers are super risk accepting folks, and they are put in harm's way quite a bit. Um, as far as I know, she might be the second or the third, depending on uh, some of the East European militaries. It might be a Slovak, Slovene. I think there might have been one other, but in terms of G7 countries, I'm pretty sure she's the first chief of defense, first child chief of defense of any of the militaries of the bigger countries of the G7 countries, and maybe any other NATO country that wasn't NATO before 2000.
okay. Well, that's really interesting and will maybe change the dynamic a little bit.
Well, it'll certainly change the dynamic in terms of how it's covered. It'll change. It'll be awkward for the conservatives to blast her, but if they're not trying to prove that they are not feminist, it it will matter. It does matter when there's a woman in the room, and we'll see how it goes. I think that the bigger problem, she faces huge problems. The military has a real recruitment and retention crisis.
Yeah.
But having a woman at the top means that any girl or woman can go, well, if she can get to the top, then I can get high within the military. Uh, so I think it sends an important signal. Uh, but again, she's more to that. But as she's put up, people are asking, is she being put on a glass cliff where, she's destined to fail? And as long as we're not in any major combat operations anytime too soon,
Yeah.
I don't think she's going to fail. It may be that she doesn't wildly succeed because the military doesn't have enough money, or the money's hard to spend, or they're being asked to do particular missions. But right now, we're pretty committed to a few things like the operations in Latvia that are
Yeah.
ongoing. So it's not gonna change too much. So I think she's the right person in the right place at the right time. I will be going to the change of command ceremony next week, so I will be able to see it happen. But I I think she's well prepared for it. She would have been chief of the army probably had she not been hornswoggled over to the new command when that
Right.
crisis happened. So she was destined to being at having a top level position. And all those 3-star officers are supposed to be prepared to take on the 4-star job if they're appointed. Now, it turns out the time before the time around, which when they appointed Art McDonald, he was ill suited for it, not just because he had a history of sexual misconduct, but also when he was not found guilty of sexual misconduct because everybody was too drunk to testify about the event. He screamed in a letter he sent to every general and admiral in the military that he
Yeah.
was exonerated, which was not his job. So he didn't understand civil military relations.
Yeah.
Uh, so she gets that much better. So I think she's much better prepared than um, than McDonald, and she's probably better prepared than Air because Air found out he was going to be chief of the defense staff a few hours before he was chief of the defense staff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It was very almost haphazard.
it was no, it was haphazard is the least description of it. It was sudden. It was because Art McDonald was found to there were credible accusations of sexual assault, so
Hmm.
they got rid of him that day, and Air got that job that day. And he said
Yeah.
publicly he had no handover. Usually the military spends a lot of time handing it over to the next person, all the information and the keys and everything else. That way the handover is smooth. They do this all the time because everybody rotates every 2 or 3 years to
Yeah.
new jobs. And so Air told me that he was very, and I think he said it out loud to other people, that he was very cognizant of that. And so he spent the past few months, or even his entire term, giving the various 2 and 3-star officers experiences to prepare them in case they are the one. So that way they get a better start, running
Then,
the start
yeah.
than he did.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. It's interesting days ahead, and we'll do this again soon.
Always a pleasure, Dale.
All right. Thanks. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.